Hello, welcome to the ALCTS webinar, From MARC to BIBFRAME, an Introduction. I'm Felicity Dicus, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be the host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Victoria Mueller and Carolyn Hanson. Victoria is the Senior Information Architect and Systems Librarian at Zafira. Zafira is the company that the Library of Congress contracted with to develop a replacement for MARC 21. Victoria has played a key role in the definition of the Bibliographic Framework Initiative, BIBFRAME, as part of this collaboration. She is also co-chair of the ALCTS LIDA MARC Formats Transition Interest Group. Carolyn is a metadata librarian at the University of Cincinnati. Her responsibilities include creating and managing metadata for library materials and digital collections. She is Victoria's co-chair on the ALCTS LIDA MARC Formats Transition Interest Group. Let me give you a few logistics for today's presentation. We don't have interactive chat capabilities, but behind the scenes you can comment on today's presentation with each other using Twitter, using the hashtag on the screen. If you have questions for Carolyn and Victoria, however, please type them into the question box on your screen. We'll answer those at the end of the presentation. We won't be monitoring the Twitter feed, so you'll need to use the question box. Carolyn and Victoria will answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides within 2 days. And now here's Victoria. There'll be a slight delay as we change speakers.
Thank you, Felicity. I'm working on sharing my screen right now. Do we see anything? I'm afraid that I have. There we go. Sorry about that delay. I appreciate the introduction, Felicity. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this webinar. We're really excited, Carolyn and I, to talk to you today. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm the Senior Information Architect at Zafira. I've worked in library systems for over 25 years, spending a long time at OCLC, and now at Zafira and in other library implementation projects. I'm also the co-chair for the MARC Formats Transition Interest Group, and in general, I just really love my data. So I call myself the Chief BibFrame Data Geek at Zafira. I've done a lot of the work with the MARC mappings and so on. So that's sort of my background. While I was putting this presentation together, I thought I really wanted to give you guys a sense of what my goals are for this portion of the webinar so that we can manage it together. The first thing I want to do is just give you a context for the genesis of coming up with BibFrame and as a MARC replacement. Then also give you a solid introduction to BibFrame, the framework, and the model. Give you some insights into the MARC to BibFrame developments that are going on. And also tell you about key projects that are happening that you can follow as they move forward. And lastly, I'm going to provide you with pointers of resources that you can continue to follow this dynamic work as it is ongoing and evolving, and everybody has a way of interacting with it. So the agenda then, based on my goals, a brief history of the genesis of BibFrame, introduction to the framework and the model. We'll look a little bit at mappings and transformation tools, talk about those current experiments, how you can get involved, and the resources. So a brief history. In 2011, the Library of Congress decided it was time that they needed to move on from MARC. The MARC standard was no longer a fit. In moving with RDA and doing data exchange, it was really time to start looking at a web environment, to start looking at linked data principles, and to utilize Resource Description Framework, RDF, as a basic data model. It's also recognized that we wanted to be able to integrate library data with other cultural heritage data on the web for more expansive user experience. So just to give everybody a sense then, the project came to be in 2012. The Library of Congress contracted with Sephira. We worked for 2 years with them, starting from basically scratch, to develop the model and the model description to kickstart the project off. We also worked at how we could be dynamic with different data sets, and we created something called profiles, which I'll go into. We defined several use cases and workflows to test the promise of the BibFrame on the web. And we opted to pursue a hands-on experiment with large libraries that had already been working in linked data. So instead of an advisory committee or so on, we went hands-on. We had the data in hand and tested it to real life workflows. So we worked with obviously the Library of Congress, the National Library of Medicine, George Washington University, the British National Library, Princeton, the German National Library, OCLC, and then Sephira. And all parties still continue to experiment and work on their efforts in BibFrame to this day. So the framework. BibFrame, as we said, is utilizing a framework that is web-based. The new platform for libraries is the web. By being on the web, we can inherit all of the amazing things that we use other web applications for in our library environment. It is the most pervasive data management and integration platform ever imagined, and now we will have our library data in the web environment. But we have to consider today, most of the web is pages and links. It's currently designed for direct human consumption, and when you say something is linked, it really just means it's pointed at. So 2 pages could link to each other, but there's no context as to why they're linking. It could be because it's a good resource and they want to validate it, or it could be because it's a bad resource. So really, simple linking is all that's going on, and the data itself on those web pages is hidden. If you look at the picture on the right, imagine you're looking at a web browser and you see a title and you see an author and you see a publication date with articles and content and tags and a license. But when you look on the left, this is the browser interpretation. There is no context. It's just, well, something's big, so it must be a headline. Something's a little smaller, so it's a subheadline, and italics and text and links. So there is a significant gap between what the browsers can interpret and what humans see. And that is why BibFrame framework is modeled around RDF. RDF is a framework that allows you to create a package around the data itself so that it can interact with other data. So we use the example of Legos a lot of times because Legos, you know, come in lots of different colors and shapes and sizes and purpose, but they all can connect together. And that is what RDF allows data to do on the semantic web. So Resource Description Framework is a common model for creating web data. It essentially consists of a subject, a predicate, and an object. These are oftentimes referred to as triples. Each of the subject, predicate, and objects will have an addressable URI, which is a uniform resource identifier that is unique to that piece of data or that linking relationship on the web. So you can now start to take your data, and in this case, this website, z.com, has a creator of me.com. And that's my RDF meaning of who created that website. So now not only are they linked, but they're linked with purpose and understanding that there's a creator involved here. So in summary with linked data, it's a term used to describe a recommended best practice for exposing and sharing connecting pieces of data, information, and knowledge on the semantic web using URIs and RDF. The other thing we have to consider too is that there are 2 webs. There is the visible web and the invisible web. The visible web is consists of content that is open to harvesters and has addressable URIs and can be found and located and indexed. The invisible web is content that's hidden inside databases or in some other way not able to be harvested. And I would say all of our OPACs are on the invisible web right now. The data inside is hidden. So I want to talk about the BibFrame model now. The BibFrame model consists of 4 different resource types. The first is the work. This reflects the conceptual essence of the cataloging item. Then the instance reflects the material embodiment of that work. Authorities reflect the key authority concepts that have defined relationships reflected in the work and instance. And annotations decorate the resource with, you can imagine things like reviews and cover art would be examples of annotations. If you've been following this work, you've probably seen this picture before. This is where the BibFrame resources are put in context with their defined relationship in the linking. So the work doesn't just point to the instance, it calls out, I have an instance, I have a creator, I have a subject, and then points to the particular URI that holds that information about that creator, subject, or instance. The instance has a publisher, it's published somewhere, and has a format. And all those pieces of data are BibFrame resources that have context and linking. So I like to take it one step further and put the actual URIs on here with some kind of a book example. So my son's favorite book is The Phantom Tollbooth. So a work would be have a URI about the work, and it would have a URI pointing to the instance. So you're going to have properties that are related more to the physical manifestation. And then each one of these, the author and the subject, the format type, the publisher, and the place of publication will all have a URI. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different websites, basically. HTML pages, I should say. HTML pages. And then an annotation of cover art. So one of the main focuses is a transition from legacy data of MARC to BibFrame. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into what is out there now that you can look at. The Library of Congress has created some tools. And if you look at that link, you can find them from their site, bibframe.org. They've created a BibFrame editor that is used to test input of data directly into BibFrame, so essentially native cataloging in BibFrame. And they have a couple of different transformation tools that you can experiment with when wanting to see how your records would convert. Zafira also has a conversion tool that we developed for our training class, and it converts MARC XML data into BibFrame resources and then shows you a lot of different views of that data. So you can see them just as resources, you can see them in an OPAC style, lots of different ways. We also created for the Library of Congress a prototype called Scribe. It's currently a beta prototype, and that is also experimenting around cataloging, but more around the different profile types. So when you look at Scribe, you can pick if you want to do a print, or if you want to do a serial, or if you want to do AV material, and then different values come up based on the type of data you want to catalog. That was a test to see how we could do that. This is a draft, but I think if there's catalogers on the call, one of the things you probably are curious about is what tags go into what resources. As I said, I'm still currently documenting this. This is a very high level right now, but essentially provides a quick snapshot into the insights of our transformation pipeline tool in a very straightforward way. So this will continue to be worked on with a conclusion of about a couple more weeks of just making sure I have it all right. But I think this view is kind of familiar for the cataloging world. But saying that, we also have to recognize that BibFrame's not all about the bib. The initial focus was on bibliographic data because that's really what MARC was intended to use. But we know that there's many communities that are non-bibliographic that have had to try and fit their data into MARC, but something like BibFrame will be really, really useful and ramp up very quickly in non-bibliographic data. Example of music and visual resources and rare books and so on. Communities will be able to define BibFrame profiles that meet their needs, and that means picking and choosing the types of properties that they want to include for cataloging. Essentially anything can be modeled in BibFrame. And Carolyn will be talking about non-MARC data, so she has some very good real-world examples in her session. So back to the Legos. we want to talk a bit about the profiles. So profiles are essentially the rules for a community's way that they're going to put a Lego set together, if I want to continue the analogy. We released this documentation in 2014 that describes the technical components of how profiles are put together. I think that what I would like you to take away is that the flexibility exists, but you don't necessarily will be working on any technical level. This will just be provided to you as part of your workflow. But I think it's nice to know that this flexibility is built in to the framework. So profiles, again, are sort of rules for how you want to put your data together. Just like with Legos, you can create lots of different things using the same kinds of data. Different communities will want to do that as well. So that's why we keep the data resources very tight and small, because we know we want to have flexibility and be able to accommodate the needs of the communities and also recognize the creative tension between legacy and future. So we still have to accommodate MARC for now, and this helps us put things down to a smaller level so that we can then put them back together. Basically, the profiles are the blueprint for a specific community's entity description. So when we put together profiles, another way we describe it is to say that you would have a common set of properties and values, or properties and entities that would be common for all things, and so we call that at this time BIBFRAME Lite. But then you can layer on in a modular way new properties and components that make something unique to that community. So serials would look different from monographs and rare books and AV, if that's what the community needs and wants. So in summary about BibFrame, the purpose of BibFrame was to replace MARC, but it's going to do so much more, and it's going to get us out on the web. The purpose is to serve libraries, but the promise is to serve not only libraries, but all memory organizations and the users they serve. And the purpose was to leverage existing web standards to speak with a consistent voice, but the promise is going to be increased visibility, increased discovery, and effectiveness. So now I want to move on to current experiments. There are several things happening and have been happening over the time. As I said, we started this by hitting the ground running. So we have a good head start. The Library of Congress I want to talk about first. They announced at ALA that they will be experimenting in original cataloging, so native BibFrame cataloging. That'll be a 2-year project that they are going to explore. A while ago, after we sort of got the framework set up, the Library of Congress put together an implementation testbed. And this encourages the development of BibFrame testing, implementations, contributions to the ongoing work, feedback on tools, feedback on vocabulary. There are several large libraries working in that testbed, and I give you a link there to see there's a registry if you want to follow up on who they are and what they're working on. Another experiment that is working on not only looking at the cataloging aspects of BibFrame, but also the integration into the larger library network. So University of Davis in California and Zafira are working together on an IMLS-funded project that is testing the theory that libraries can't adopt modern technology if the current workflow and environment is constrained by complex workflows. We all know that we do things every day because that's the way the system needs it done, not because that's the best way to do it. So they're exploring all of the different kinds of interdependencies of the software and the service providers to come up with a study that shows us the way forward. And they have a blog where you can follow all of their use cases and work. Another experiment that's out there is called Linked Data for Libraries, and that's short LD for L. It is with Stanford University, Cornell, and the Harvard Library Innovation Lab. And their goal is to create an information store of the captured intellectual value that librarians and domain experts bring together when they describe, annotate, and organize resources. They have that project running through January 2016, and it is funded by the Mellon Foundation. And the link to their project page is at the bottom. Another experiment that's going out there that is one I work on every day is called LibHub. Sapphira founded the LibHub initiative, which aims to raise the visibility of libraries on the web. So we are working with several large public libraries right now as early adopters, and taking their data and converting it and putting it out on the web to test the concept that libraries linking together with overlapping assets will rise up to very visible places on search engines. And if you're interested in looking more about LibHub and what's going on with that, go to the website there and take the pledge, believing that everyone benefits from visibility of libraries and their content on the web. And just to go a little bit deeper, those libraries that we're working with, as far as what they're doing and what we're doing with them, they were interested in being early adopters in moving to linked data and moving to getting their data on the web. And they worked with us and grabbed a section of projects and products that work together to help work towards a data pilot. So the first thing we do with them is we worked with them with practical practitioner training. So we're all on the same vocabulary and same page on where we're going. And then we spend some time assessing the readiness of their environment. So their system vendors, how ready are they for linked data? How ready is their team? How ready is their data itself? One of the things that's really valuable about the readiness assessment is the interaction we have with vendors and system vendors, anyone who's providing data to the library. We have a very good relationship with many people in that front, and that is a value to the library to have a voice in that. Then the linked data pilot is the last thing we work with. So up to 1 million of their records, if they have a collection that large, are converted to BIBFRAME and exposed to the web. Our first 12 were public libraries, but we're adding an academic focus as well. That'll focus probably a little more on things like special collections and smaller collections that we can enhance and integrate into the larger web and outside of the catalog. So this is the question that we get a lot, and we're ready to start answering it. You know, can I see it? I did this search yesterday, so of course ranking fluctuates occasionally, but in this case, the Denver Public Library has several records that we've converted to BibFrame and put out on the web for harvesters. The one collection they have is around a local celebrity, Molly Brown, who survived the Titanic, and they gave us several records around her. So I did this search. This one was in Google yesterday. And there is, number one on the page, the Denver Public Library catalog record. That's there because of the way we're pointing at it, but this catalog record was never before available on the web. And so now we can start to see the efforts of the experiment are really playing themselves out. And as we get all 12 of these libraries up and more, we really expect to see some dynamic visibility of libraries in everyday life. So how can you get involved? There's several ways to get involved. Follow those projects. Take a look and see things are moving all the time very quickly. Explore the tools. I have on the resource page, I have links to the tools that I talked about from Library of Congress and from Sapphira, and those are open source. You are welcome to experiment with those. There's a BibFrame discussion list. There are other discussions of BibFrame on some of the cataloging lists as well. If you're attending ALA, there will be several sessions, I'm sure. The two that I know are on there for sure are the one that Carolyn and I are putting together, which is on Saturday at 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. The focus for this one will be on tools. We have already worked with Terry Reese from MARC Edit. He will be there doing demos, and he's been working on BibFrame with us for several years now. And then also Roy Tennant from OCLC will be there. And we're still possibly going to have another person. So please come to that session if you're interested in there. There's always a BibFrame update on Sunday at 10 o'clock, so I encourage you to attend that. And if you're interested in training, like I said, Zafira offers linked data training and have that link there for you. The other thing we do is we keep the alumni group together, so it's a growing group of people who can experiment and exchange information and ideas. So here's a page of resources. I think if you're really interested in getting the background of this, these are the papers that were written throughout the course of our contract with Library of Congress. There are also pages here that were written as research papers around AV, around some of the Library of Congress and OCLC work. So these links are all here for that. And then there's also a couple articles. Like I said, there's training, and those then there are the links to the tools. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. I really appreciate it, and thank you. And then I think we're going to move to Carolyn.
Sorry, it'll just be a moment so I can share my screen. Working on Mac is a little more challenging. Do you hate when you have technical issues? There we go. Okay. Hi, my name is Carolyn Hanson. I'm metadata librarian at the University of Cincinnati Libraries, and I will be talking in this session about BibFrame for non-MARC metadata. I think Vicki gave a really excellent overview of BibFrame and some of the current experiments that are happening. And I'm here to talk about an experiment at my own library at the University of Cincinnati in regards to a collection of special collections and archival materials that we are trying to increase the visibility of on the web. So our agenda for this session is to discuss first, an introduction to BibFrame and non-MARC metadata, in which I'll be providing a description of how BibFrame is a flexible model that can be used in a variety of different ways. We'll then talk about why BibFrame and linked data for non-MARC metadata collections. I think this is especially important because there's a belief that digital collections are part of the visible web, when in fact they may actually be invisible to search harvesters and to our users. And lastly, we'll be talking about a real-world example that I worked on with another faculty member at UC. His name is Sean Crow, and he's the electronic resources librarian here. And this is a project that we used to convert a collection of Dublin core records from the Neal Armstrong Commemorative Archive to BibFrame. You'll see on the right side of your screen is an image of Neil Armstrong from the Commemorative Archive collection. It was taken in 1977. And it shows Neil Armstrong at the Lunken Airport, which is a municipal airport within the city of Cincinnati. And throughout this presentation, we'll have images from the collection that you'll be able to view. So our introduction. BibFrame is designed not only as a replacement for MARC, which Vicki talked about in her promise section of her talk, but it's also designed to be a model that can be schema agnostic, which means it can work with a variety of different schemas and models. This is really interesting for folks that are working in non-MARC metadata because it gives us an opportunity to use an ontology that is consistent across platforms. So I can take EAD records, I can take my MARC records, I am able to map them all to BibFrame, and we can have one cohesive data set that is expressed in the same schema or model. BibFrame can be used with various non-MARC schemas, like Dublin Core or DC, Encoded Archival Description or EAD, VRA, which is the Visual Resources Association schema, MODS, which is the Metadata Object Description schema, which is a more robust form of metadata that's often used instead of Dublin Core, or custom schemas. An example of working with a custom schema, I'm sorry, apparently the question box is showing. I will try to get that out of here. No, I do not want to leave the webinar. still not minimize. We'll try to move it over just a little bit more. I apologize for that, and we'll keep going. So it can be used with non-MARC schemas, and lastly, it can improve the discoverability of unique archival and special collections materials. As libraries, particularly public libraries or academic libraries, we often share a core set of materials. And what makes our institution a research destination is often the archival and special collections that we want to increase the visibility of on the web. So BIBFRAME is an option that we can use to create this visibility. And now I cannot go. So why BIBFRAME for non-MARC metadata? And specifically, we're working with digital collections. I think that there's a misconception that digital collections are always visible on the web because they're not within siloed systems like OPACs. We have a general understanding that it can be difficult for web harvesters to harvest the content within an OPAC or an ILS system, but this problem also exists when you're working with systems online for digital collections. I'm going to pick on DSpace here because DSpace is the collection management software that the University of Cincinnati uses. And we have problems with DSpace and our search engine harvesters. Oftentimes, a search engine is able to harvest the collection level record, but not the individual item records within the collection. So despite the fact that your collection is, quote unquote, already online, it may not be actually being harvested as effectively as possible by search engine harvesters. There's also the idea that if your digital collection is described with clean metadata that adheres to standards, that it will be findable. And I think that what is happening here is that as catalogers, my background is in cataloging, we have this idea that if we create metadata that adheres to standards, if we work with controlled vocabularies, if we make perfect records, which is always our goal as a cataloger, that our resources will be findable. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things for me when working with BIBFRAME was learning that that's actually not the case on the web. That though we describe things in depth and with great clean metadata, it doesn't necessarily make our resources findable. And that's a huge shift in thinking when you approach bibliographic description outside of these more traditional systems like OPACs. Here's an example to illustrate this point. This is a record from the University of Cincinnati's Digital Resource Commons, which is our digital collection software. Again, it's a DSpace installation. And we see a Dublin Core record. This is the image we saw earlier in the slideshow, hopefully, of Neal Armstrong greeting the fictional character Snoopy. What you'll see is a Dublin Core a qualified Dublin Core record that has relatively extensive metadata. This includes under dc.subject, it includes well-formed headings that come from the Library of Congress name authority file, and also includes a heading from the Library of Congress subject heading file under dc.subject.lcsh. We have quite a bit of descriptive information linking, or it looks to link to other collections and series under dc.relation.is part of and dc.relation is part of series. But what is actually being shown to a web harvester? What can we say is being seen and exposing our data on the web? And here is where the heartbreak happens. So we see our very well-created record, and now we see this. So the title of the screen is that clean, correct metadata only goes so far. This is an image using an extension for the browser Chrome that is called Green Turtle. And what Green Turtle does is it shows us the underlying RDF triples beneath a page. And what you'll see here is the underlying triple for the record that we saw in the previous slide. And you'll notice that all we have is a link to the Creative Commons license. We don't have any information about the content of the image. We don't have any information that would tell a web harvester that if you're looking to do an image search of Snoopy and Neal Armstrong, that this would be the image that you would get. So we have found in looking at search results when searching for our collection that oftentimes we will have results that show up earlier in our search results that are from crowdsourced applications. One example is that if someone pins an image from our collection to Pinterest, we will find that the result will be in the top 5 of the results, but the actual record itself will be much lower. And that's simply because there are more links, more entities linking to Pinterest than are linking to our page. And on our page in the DRC, we're not doing enough to link out to increase our relevancy rankings. So what do we do about this problem? How can we actually implement BibFrame for non-MARC metadata? I'm going to be talking about some policies that were implemented with my colleague Sean Crow and I as we attempted to map a BibFrame collection from Dublin Core to BibFrame. And these are the results that we came up with while working. And the first is, I think, the most important, is that when working with non-MARC metadata, we want to map for discovery and not preservation. Working with these types of records gives us more flexibility than we're working with MARC. We talked quite a bit in the earlier part of the presentation, as well as with the library community as a whole, about migrating data from from MARC to BibFrame. So it's an idea of a lossless mapping, a one-to-one or an archival mapping, because we're trying to create an actually archival preservation mapping. However, when working with non-MARC metadata, I would encourage you to instead map for discovery. So to create a core set of elements that we know we want to bring out in order to create these links. Again, focus on linking as much as possible. And in order to do this, we have to be able to do 2 things. The first is to rely on specialized standards for complete description, not BibFrame. It's the idea that we should be converting Dublin Core metadata or ERD metadata to BibFrame. But I would encourage you not to do that, and instead to have these communities that have created specialized niche schemas. Those schemas were designed for a reason, and we want to maintain them. For example, at UC, our EAD records, our encoded archival description records, live in a finding aid repository. And we certainly don't want to prevent those records from being found or take them down. They're serving a purpose there. But what we want to do is to be able to create a map of specific elements to bring out those records and to increase the amount of linking that can be done so that the search results are improved. The second is to rely on existing platforms and systems that house complete records. So again, we're using the Finding Aid portal. We're using our DSpace installation for our Dublin Core records. We're not going to take those records down. We use those systems that we already have to be the host for the complete record. Again, treating BibFrame as a vehicle for discovery, not for preservation, and not for complete discovery, simply for web discovery. And last is that OpenRefine is a great tool for building custom RDF. OpenRefine was a tool that my colleague and I used extensively while we were working through our process of mapping. OpenRefine was formerly Google Refine, and it is an application that you can download. It is open source. And what it allows you to do is first to clean your metadata, as well as to link to external authorities. There are reconciliation services with DBpedia and with other aggregators of material. There's also an extension that is available for download that allows you to export your metadata in RDF. So what you can do through OpenRefine is to upload the BibFrame vocabulary and then map that vocabulary to RDF using OpenRefine and can export in RDF. So it's a very nice tool if you're not interested in creating a lot of scripts for transformation. It's also a tool that you can use today. So I know that there's so much talk about different transformation tools that we're waiting for as a community, and this is something that you can really you can go ahead and implement whenever you're ready to implement it. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, and it's exciting that you can, instead of having to wait for tools to be developed, you can actually use existing tools and map yourself. So let me talk a little bit about our project. Neal Armstrong was a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati in the 1970s, and there's a collection of materials in the Neal Armstrong Commemorative Archive. It's a collection of approximately 218 items. It includes textual information, photographs, ephemera, and artifacts. And we really wanted these materials to be highlighted within our system and within the web. And so what we did was we identified a core set of metadata elements for discovery. We mapped those elements from Dublin Core to BibFrame, and we used OpenRefine, as I discussed on the previous slide, to link to external authorities. We linked to external authorities including LC, VIAF, which is the Virtual International Authority File, Wikipedia, and corporate websites for corporate name entities. And I think that one of the things to think about as well when working with BibFrame is that the idea of authority is much broader than it is with, much broader than working with traditional library description. We're not just working with controlled vocabularies. An authority can be a website. An authority can be various types of entities within the web. So an article on Neil Armstrong that's from Wikipedia is considered an authority, although it would not be in a traditional MARC cataloging environment. So we have to, again, shift the way that we think about these terms when applying them to a web environment. So after we completed our mapping and reconciled all of our records against the external authorities, we then exported our metadata in RDF, and then we expressed it in Turtle, and that is what you see on the right-hand side of your screen. So what you're seeing is the expression of Turtle. Turtle is it's a terse RDF triple language. So that sounds kind of scary, but it's just an easier way of expressing RDF than in XML. So for example, in XML, it can be very long and difficult to read, and Turtle is just shorter, and it's much easier to work with. I think what I have found, especially when working with RDF data dumps or working with extensive amounts of RDF, is that, again, it's designed to be read by a machine, not a person. And so as a person trying to read the data, if you can find shortcuts to make the data easier to read, like using Turtle, you should certainly do so. And if you go to LC's BibFrame website and use their transformation tools, their data is often expressed in Turtle. So now you know what Turtle is. We then took our records and we put them on an external server, and it's an RDF dump. So there's nothing that we're doing with those records. It's static. We put the records up, and then harvesters come along and they harvest the data, and hopefully our relevancy rankings will improve. What are the challenges of this type of project? Well, there are many. The first is that the BibFrame vocabulary is still evolving. This is not a stable model. We have undergone changes, and we know that the vocabulary in the model is going to change in the coming year. We are ending the early adopter stage. We're going through experimentation. We know that the vocabulary is going to change. And one of the benefits of mapping for discovery is that if a model changes in 6 months or a year, we don't have to change as many fields. We don't have to make as many updates to the metadata that we've already mapped and expressed on RDF. So that's one benefit, again, of mapping for discovery. The next is that there's a lack of best practices and guidelines, and this is simply because the framework is so new. We're hoping that as this develops within the next couple of years, that these types of practices and guidelines and documentation will be available. It will be easier for those that are working in this in a later date. There's also a few early adopters that are working with non-MARC metadata and BibFrame. I think that when Sean and I began this project, we were trying to find other examples. It was very difficult for us to find examples of data that had been converted. It was difficult for us to find people to talk to, simply because most of the testing and most of the experimentation has been thus far with MARC. But it's likely that that will change within the next year. And lastly, and significantly, there is no Sparkle endpoint for id.loc.gov. So let's break down that statement. id.loc.gov is LC's linked data service, and a Sparkle endpoint is a way for you to perform automated queries on RDF data dumps, for example. So by using a Sparkle endpoint, I can search for 200 name authorities within a data set of RDF at once. I don't have to manually search one by one. So ID.loc.gov does not have a Sparkle endpoint. It does have some workarounds. The first workaround is that you can download metadata datasets from ID.loc.gov. An example would be LCNAF, the name authority file, or LCSH, the subject headings file, and use a tool such as Apache Jenna to spin up a local endpoint, a local Sparkle endpoint. The problem with doing this is that it can be very slow. So for example, in our own research, when we tried to create this Sparkle endpoint, we were successful. However, working with something like LCNAF, which is over a gig in terms of its file size, we just didn't really have the computing power to do this very fast. One example would be that we tried to reconcile approximately 30 names, and it took about 4 hours. So it would be very helpful for folks in the future if ID.loc.gov would have a Sparkle endpoint that could work effectively. Additionally, we're hoping that we can continue to work with the Sparkle endpoint that we have, simply just letting it run on our machines. If you're working with a very large data set, I think that any help that you can get with linking in OpenRefine or in whatever application that you're using is very helpful. So what are the next steps for our project for the Neal Armstrong archive? The first is that we want to integrate related MARC records from our general library collections into this data set. So we've identified a series or a set of approximately 300 records within our OPAC and ILS system related to Neal Armstrong. We'd like to express those in BibFrame and map them and create RDF so that we have one data set that is able to link collections within our general library collections to our digital collections. Next, we are concerned about SEO considerations. How can we improve the visibility and the harvestability of our RDF data dump? Is there anything that we can do to make that data more findable by harvesters? And lastly, analytics. So we are trying to figure out whether what we've done is actually making a difference. Is it making our relevancy rankings higher? And this is something that we've had a little bit of trouble with because of difficulties with our servers on our end. So our data is not actually available yet, but it should be within the next couple of weeks. So our step is to do research to figure out how this is impacting the discoverability of our collections. The next page is a link of resources to the information that I've talked about. And thank you very much. I am ending with one of my favorite pictures from the Neal Armstrong Commemorative Archive. It is Neal Armstrong creating a paper airplane at an event, a student event at the University of Cincinnati. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn and Victoria. Gave me a lot to think about. And everyone, we have time for questions or comments. So just please add them to the question box there, and I'll go through those. I'm going to start out with a basic question, Victoria. So you showed a screen showing a mapping of a BibFrame item and MARC. So are there going to be, I don't know if it's a data element or vocabulary, is there going to be a one-to-one correlation between our really granular MARC data elements or RDA data elements and an element in BibFrame?
So there's a couple answers to that. It's been worked around in use cases, and so the Library of Congress is doing something very granular in their transformation because they're trying to stay true to the MARC and retain everything. Some other libraries, like National Library of Medicine, are looking at things that they say, well, what's really needed? That we've done the most work with National Library of Medicine and George Washington on mapping RDA vocabulary itself. What I showed you was the MARC tags that we extracted to create resources, and our goal is visibility. But in general, there's a working convergence of those three approaches. So I think what we'll end up with is what is needed, so that some of the MARC data that we all know really doesn't need to be there anymore will probably fall out, and the relevant things and their intentions will be promoted and used. So eventually, yeah, I think we're going to find a convergence. Right now, it's experiments.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Here's another basic question. What does RDF stand for?
Resource Description Framework.
Okay.
And that's the standard that was created for the semantic web, so that we can provide the meaning in the links of the data.
Okay. Let's see. Now, Victoria, what is going to happen when the contract with the Library of Congress ends?
So the contract we had with Library of Congress ended about a year ago. We were brought in to create actual deliverables. So we created the model, we created some use cases, profile, so the basic structure. And then now they've moved on to do their experiments, and we've kind of moved on to do our experiments. So we stay in touch, and we continue to work with each other's projects and understand each other's projects, but the basic contract, which had deliverables, is over.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
This is an interesting question. How does Google feel about BibFrame? It seems like it could flood the results lists with hundreds of libraries that have the same book. It also seems to compete a bit with the Google Scholar feature that lets you set your library in your profile.
One of the things that about Zafira is that many of our team members have worked on the web since the early 90s and are very familiar with some of the researchers at Google. They're excited about this, and I guess if I could, I have a slide that would actually illustrate some of this. But yeah, okay, let me just show that. Let me minimize this. So think about it in the same sense of shopping and how shopping evolved. So right now, if you can see the screen, I have an example of a book that you can't see anything about. And then you have sort of the union catalog model of this book is held by these other libraries. But it's better to point at those institutions have that book, because then you are raising the ranks and have other people point at it. And what's going to happen is this pattern is already in place. Hold on a second. The shopping. So if you look for laptops, all of a sudden it starts to consolidate. So Google's happy to have all that information. They're just going to present it to you different. And they're going to deal with what's in the market. So you could imagine this would look like this way now. All of a sudden the Great Gatsby is finding a library, it's consolidated and available. So I thought this slide would help ground that question.
Okay, so you think all these individual library records will be collated like that in one place?
Exactly.
Which will make it easier for users too. Exactly.
That's the theory. That's what they've done in the past.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I like the question too. So
here's a comment from when Carolyn was talking. Very cool result, the Google search Neal, Armstrong, and Snoopy. So someone must have searched that at the time. I thought it was pretty cool. Alrighty.
It is, and I hope you found our record and not just the Pinterest record. The Pinterest has been kind of a thorn in my paw. I'm glad that it comes up there, but I would like our records to come up first.
Here's another question for clarification. When you say harvester, are you meaning a Google or Bing search or something different? When you're saying records are getting harvested.
Yeah, either one of us could answer that, I guess. It's essentially just, yeah, search engines are harvesters. Anything that's crawling the web and accumulating information and metadata around URIs is a harvester. You might, it doesn't have to be a search engine, but that's the most common thing that we're familiar with.
Okay. How would a mixed MARC 21 BibFrame environment work in practice? And if BibFrame replaces MARC bibliographic data, what will replace MARC authority data in the near future? And I guess that's interesting to me too, since Carolyn mentioned they don't need to change their Dublin core, they're just transforming it.
So one of the things that we talk a lot about is that the sort of the bell curve of adoption. The last thing that's going to get worked on is back office systems. So the first thing that we're going to do is focus on visibility, focus on the web, and focus on native BibFrame. But they'll be switching stations. I think we're looking at the idea of middleware. So we can't immediately turn a switch and stop using MARC. We have to keep using MARC. But we can leverage the benefits of BibFrame that are existing now, and then still keep a look at the workflows that we have in MARC and try to find the middle ground. And that's what a lot of the projects are doing, specifically BibFlow. So the answer is we're not really sure, but we're working on ways to make those coexist.
Okay, since we're talking about connections, what is the connection between BibFrame and schema.org? And maybe you could explain schema.org for people who don't know that.
Okay, well, schema.org is a language for marking up the types of information you have in a web page. So you would describe that this is a book, and this is its title, and so on. And that's used for SEO kind of purposes mostly. And BibFrame is actually getting down to the actual data so that each resource, so a work or an instance or an authority, has its own HTML page. So all of the data in there is discoverable. And schema.org is more like metadata about a web page, whereas BibFrame is creating web pages out of data.
Okay.
And they'll overlap in some ways too, but that's probably the most fundamental difference between them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have an interesting one, that there is a comment. Thank you for this interesting seminar. We've learned a lot. And here's the question. If, as Carolyn said, there are few early adopters, where's the push to convert coming from?
I can say within my own institution, the push to convert for non-MARC came from me. This is something that I was interested in trying to research and experiment with. You know that certainly the community, the library community, is interested in BibFrame and sees this as the next step in the evolution of the way that we describe resources. And I think that for me, again, it's the frustration of not being able to find the materials that we spend so much time cataloging that has pushed me to want to experiment with these types of projects. I think one of the challenges that we're at right now is that we're dealing with these experimentations and we don't know if they're going to work. We think that they will, we hope that they will, but the research is all still so new. It's possible that in 5 years we may have a very different landscape. It's just really hard to say right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hopeful that more people will be experimenting and more people will be adding to this conversation. So for everyone on the line that wants to experiment with non-MARC metadata, drop me a line on Twitter or talk to me on email, and let's keep the conversation going.
Great. And just a reminder, you will be getting the slides, so you'll have Carolyn's contact information on those. Okay. Yeah, I just want to point out here what someone in the audience pointed out is that Victoria had a slide about Zafira training, and that some of that training has a fee attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
Just so we're clear about that. Okay, this is a question we're all probably wondering about. Any ballpark estimation when the transformation to BibFrame will take place?
Well, I think we could say it's happening now. Again, if you're looking at a bell curve of how BibFrame is being used, we just converted 1 million of Denver Public Library's records to BibFrame and put them on the web. Now, that doesn't mean we're cataloging in it and over time, but I think this is going to be an evolution. And you can do what Carolyn's doing and do experiments with things that you want to play with. As far as completely 100%, who knows? But the idea is you can do stuff now, and so I'd say it's happening, and experiment with it, and that counts.
Great.
I think as well that I would add that we're dealing with two separate issues. One is the development of the framework in terms of theory and ontology and profiles, and we're doing all this intellectual work, and on the other hand is the component of our vendors and our systems. And until we have enough critical mass around BibFrame as a library community that says to vendors, we need systems that will handle BibFrame in an appropriate way and will provide our linked data to the web in a way that it can access and harvest, we won't be seeing those types of large-scale transformations. I think there's this desire, and I certainly have the same desire to say, this is the date when we will transfer over, but we are reliant on the systems and the vendors in order to make that transformation successful.
And just to note, we work with a lot of those system vendors, and they have put linked data in BibFrame, several of them, like III, Atlas Systems, Cersei Dynex, as top priorities for their next year. So the conversation is happening. Those individuals are excited, and you know, I think we're gonna, and I think libraries are going to be able to drive more than they have in the past.
Right. And I guess, too, what strikes me is that there's the two parts, getting the data elements and getting the linked data.
Yeah.
That you've talked about.
Yeah, there's several moving parts.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to say we've run out of time here. There's a couple more questions which we'll send to Carolyn and Victoria, and then we'll send the answers out with the email that you get with the PowerPoint slides and the recording slides. So I'm sure we could keep going on. This is very interesting.
Well, thanks, everybody. We enjoyed
Yes,
it.
thank you very much.
So, yeah, let me give a thanks to our presenters, Carolyn and Victoria. Also to the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee that planned and produced this, and especially to our technical support people, Iping Chen Gaffey, Mary Reeder, and Emily Whitmore, who've made this possible, and the ALCTS office, who provides a lot of support to make these happen. And so for our spring series, we have one more webinar next week, Improving Morale, and a virtual pre-conference, Planning for the Evolving Role of Metadata Services. So there's going to be 3 different sessions, and I hope you follow the link up at the top because they're really interesting and some probably related to some of this. And we're already planning for our fall series, and you'll find information about those on the ALCTS website also. ALCTS Continuing Education also provides web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks, and e-forums, which are a couple days. One just ended up, the one about the MLS, but you can go to the archives, and we have an upcoming one in July about preparing for retirement. So thanks to you all for joining us. Please join us for future events, and if you have ideas of what we can do, please submit a proposal and we'll look at that. And that concludes our session for today.